I've noticed that roughly 75 to 80% of my baseball players are narrow infrasternal angles, ISAs. Jerry works with about 99% of baseball players. Do you feel this is representative of a normal population? I'm wondering if this is a case of selection bias where narrow ISAs, being more eccentrically oriented, have an easier time rotating, and therefore would be more likely to advance in a rotational sport like baseball or golf. Whereas a more concentrically oriented wide ISA may have a more difficult time and as a result would be more biased towards sports requiring less rotation. I think Terry's onto something here. It's not a perfect translation, but he's definitely on the right track. So what we have to look at is how rotation differs between a narrow and a wide infrasternal angle. And the hashtag major key, I'm like a skinnier DJ Khaled, but the major key is what the obliques are doing in each of these infrasternal angle presentations. Now, based on the shape of the lower rib cage, certain obliques are going to have more leverage in a narrow versus a wide. And there's a great paper that I'm pulling from that looks at the inter-rater reliability of infrasternal angle presentations. They go into how the external versus internal oblique differs depending on the shape of the rib cage. And if you want to check that out, well, folks, you need to check out the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/rotational-athletes. There's going to be podcasts, the high-def YouTube version, and an accompanying blog, as well as links to everything else. Definitely check it out when it's up on Sunday. In this paper, they talk about two different obliques, the external and internal oblique. If you are a wide infrasternal angle, your internal oblique has better leverage. If you are a narrow infrasternal angle, your external oblique has better leverage. This has to do with the attachment points of these respective muscles. External is more on the outside of the rib cage. Hence, if I have a narrow ISA, the outer attachments are going to be able to compress and rotate the rib cage much more effectively. Internal oblique is a little bit more internal on the rib cage and has more of its attachments along the iliac crest, among other locations. Now, when you are rotating your body, your obliques are your biggest rotators in the lower part of the thorax. Both need to work in order for you to rotate. External oblique works on one side, internal oblique works more on the other side, and then when you go the other way, it flip-flops. But we have to look at how those oblique muscles impact the abdominal viscera when we perform rotation. Because it turns out, folks, that the ability to manipulate the viscera can be a rate-limiting step in your supreme rotational clientele. Stay tuned. With each ISA presentation, both obliques, internal and external, have the capability of compressing the abdominal cavity. So when you contract them bilaterally, it makes the abdominal cavity smaller, it compresses. That's one reason why the abs are a muscle of exhalation, because it helps squeeze the air out by compressing the viscera. Now, folks, we have to ask ourselves, which abdominal obliques would have better compressive capabilities in the ab wall? I'm glad that we asked ourselves. The key muscles that would compress the ab wall are the external obliques over the internal obliques, because they have greater leverage to do so, because they are more superficial. They can push on the rib cage a lot harder. When that push on the rib cage happens, based on the narrow infrapubic angle that is seen with a narrow infrasternal angle, remember folks, has more concentrically biased external obliques. When I squeeze the lower rib cage, the viscera is going to move downward. Since the infrapubic angle is narrowed and I have much larger surface area in the top part of the pelvis, aka the pelvic inlet, the guts have the capability of moving down, getting out of the way of the upper part of the lower thorax to allow me to rotate effectively. So I squeeze it down so the guts don't limit my rotational capabilities because they're not taking up as much space in the lower thorax. Since there's a lot of rotational action in that area, theoretically, a narrow ISA is going to have an easier time rotating because they don't have the physical block as much of the viscera. The viscera will get in the way. On the flip side, a wide ISA has a problem with visceral mobilization when they're rotating. Because the rib cage is wider, the internal obliques don't have as good a leverage depressing the viscera because the internal obliques can't compress the lower rib cage as well as the external obliques can. That's one thing. The other thing is for those individuals who are wide ISA, having a wider infrapubic angle and a nutated sacrum, the pelvic floor is going to be more ascended. So when the wide attempts to push the viscera downward, you have a pelvic floor that is pushing upward. So the guts ride a little higher in the case of the wide infrasternal angle. So the guts stay up higher in the lower part of the rib cage. And so those infrasternal angle presentations are not going to have as easy of a time moving the guts out of the way when they go through the rotational action of a baseball swing or a golf swing. And because of that, those differences in the ability to mobilize the viscera in the lower rib cage, the narrow infrasternal angle theoretically has an easier time creating rotation in that region compared to a wide infrasternal angle, or at least they can do it faster because of their ability to move the viscera out of the way. Now, folks, does that mean that, well, okay, I got a wide infrasternal angle, I guess that means I can never be a high-level baseball player or a golfer, I might as well just stick to powerlifting? False. Here's the interesting thing, folks. So at Elevate Sports Performance and Healthcare, where I work, we get a lot of high-level golfers. And most of the high-level golfers that I've worked with, ones that are on the tour or they're very good amateurs, they're wide ISAs. How in the heck is that possible? I think the reason why that's possible is because structural lower thorax structure is only one component of the ability to rotate well. You have the rest of the body that needs to be able to rotate effectively. I have to be able to rotate in the upper thorax. The pelvis has to be able to rotate also. And if you have any deficits in those areas, or if I'm an athlete who can compensate in some way, shape, or form in those areas, I might be able to pick up leverage to be able to rotate enough that I can still perform my sport quite well. A prime example of this would be if you looked at the steroid era of baseball. So Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa. I think, now obviously they had the juice involved in a lot of those cases, but if you look at their body structure, clearly those folks are not narrow infrasternal angle presentations. So they can still hit a baseball incredibly well. And in fact, someone who has a wider rib cage, even though they might not be able to rotate as fast, they're going to be able to rotate with much more power because of leverage in other specific areas. Even though the abs play a huge role in rotation, it's not the only part that we rotate through. And you could conceive of someone who's restricted anteriorly and posteriorly in the thorax, especially if they're a narrow infrasternal angle, they may stink at rotation because when you rotate, you have to be able to expand both front side and back side, depending on what direction you're rotating in. There's blogs that I'll link that will dive into a bit more in that when you check out the show notes. The second piece, and we cannot ignore this, is that rotation is a skill, and we can't discount the skill component of your ability to rotate, whether it's swinging a baseball or swinging a golf club. And I have one guy in particular right now who I'm working with who's he's a high-level amateur golfer, wide ISA, very stiff ability to rotate in the uppermost segments of the thorax, but he's one of the most consistent hitters out there. And that's why he's so good. And the reason why is because he can put the ball where he wants to, and he knows how to move his body within the constraints that he has available. There's a skill component. And he might be able to do better than someone who perhaps has better movement capabilities but doesn't have the skill fine-tuned to the extent that he does. Skill plays a big role in your ability to perform anything. And if you know how to move your body within the constraints available, you could potentially do significantly better than someone who moves better than you. Interesting thing with this guy, we've been working on some stuff to increase his range of motion where he's restricted, and he's adding several yards to his hits. He's hitting straighter now because of this, because he would hit it off even though it would go where he wanted it to go. And his club speed has changed just by increasing his movement repertoire. Motion that's available is only one component, and skill many times can trump your movement capabilities. So we have to look at all of these factors because they all play a role in one's ability to rotate effectively or not. To summarize your amazing question, Terry, narrow ISAs definitely have a greater ability to rotate because of their ability to mobilize the guts and the leverage of the external obliques. But lower thorax rotation is only one piece of the equation. You got to look at the uppers, you got to look at the pelvis, and you have to look at the skill that is involved with rotation.